The key turned twice in the lock, and the small particular sound of it carried through the oak, as though the house itself had drawn a breath and held it. Marizette stood very still in the middle of the east wing sitting room and listened to her husband's boots go away down the gallery, unhurried even, a man walking from a settled decision rather than fleeing one. She did not run to the door, nor rattle the handle, nor call his name into the wood. She had learned, in the 4 days since they had brought her up here, that the watching servants reported every cry, and that a calm woman was harder to call mad than a frantic one. So she counted his steps until the sound of them was gone, and only then did she let her hand rise to her throat, where her own pulse was beating hard enough to feel. Outside the tall windows the November afternoon was going gold and gray over the park, the bare elms standing in their long blue shadows, the lake a sheet of pewter beyond the ha-ha. It was a beautiful country, and she was 24 years old, and she had been married 11 months, and her husband had just locked her into 3 rooms at the cold end of his great house. The fire had not been lit. No one had lit it for 2 days. She drew her thin shawl closer and went to the window and put her fingers against the glass, and the cold of it came through like water. What the household believed she already knew, because Mrs. Brierly had whispered it to her through the keyhole that first night weeping, before the housekeeper was sent down to the kitchens and forbidden the wing. The household believed the new countess had taken a fever of the brain, that she wandered the corridors at night, that she had been found at the top of the great stair with no memory of climbing it, and that twice she had spoken of a man in the muniment room who was not there. The household believed their master had done a hard and loving thing, shutting his wife away where she could not harm herself, until the physician could be brought again and a quieter future arranged. The household believed this because a careful man had spent 2 months teaching them to believe it, one small, staged scene at a time, and because the careful man was not the Earl. Marizette pressed her forehead to the glass and made herself breathe. She was not mad. She knew the precise shape of every hour that had been turned against her, because she had been awake inside each one. She knew who had moved the candlestick and who had left the muniment room door ajar at midnight, so that a sleepless wife might be found near it. She knew the man whose patient, smiling cruelty had built this room around her, like a shell around a pearl. And she knew one thing that he did not know she knew, one thing he had forgotten or never learned, the only secret in the whole cold house that was hers alone. There was a passage. It ran inside the thickness of the old wall, from the dressing closet of this very wing down through the chimney breast to a low door that opened behind the linen press in the muniment room, 2 floors below. A child had shown it to her, the steward's grandson, in the bright first weeks of her marriage, when she had been mistress of the place and not its prisoner. And the boy had made her swear not to tell, because his grandfather would scold him for going where he ought not. She had laughed and sworn. She had thought it a charming secret of an old house. She had not known then that a secret could be a door out of a grave. How a woman comes to stand at a cold window, counting her husband's footsteps, begins in the spring, in the assembly rooms at the market town, where she first saw the Earl of Thornbeck, and decided, with the swift private certainty she had always trusted in herself, that he was the loneliest man in the room. Her name then was Marizette Harlowe, and she was the daughter of a clergyman with more learning than living. A tall, plain girl, people said, who read too much and danced too little, and looked a beat too long. She had no fortune to speak of. She had a way of being silent that made the silly nervous, and a habit of seeing what other people had agreed not to see. The Earl came late to the assembly, and stood at the edge of it like a man at the edge of a cliff. He was perhaps 36 then, tall and stern and beautifully made, with dark hair brushed back hard from a grave brow and gray eyes the color of slate under rain. He did not dance. He answered when spoken to and offered nothing further, and the mothers of the town drew their daughters along past him with the lowered murmur that follows a great prize. One cannot quite reach the room had decided what he was. The room had decided he was the cold Earl, the proud Earl. The Earl who had buried a first wife 3 years gone and had no heart left to bury anything else. Marizette watched him for the better part of an hour and saw something else entirely. She saw a man who flinched very slightly every time the small orchestra began a particular country dance, and who turned his shoulder to the dancing the instant it did. She saw him take a glass and not drink from it. She saw him watch a young couple laughing by the long windows, with an expression she had no word for then, and would have every word for later. When at last they were introduced by an aunt who despaired of her, Marizette did not flatter him, and did not flinch from him. She asked him whether he found assemblies a torment, and his slate eyes came up to her face, and stayed there a beat too long, and he said, his voice low, that he found most things a torment, and that she was the first person in some years to ask him plainly, instead of pretending she had not noticed. They were married in September, against the advice of nearly everyone she knew. Her father blessed it because he loved her, and because an earl was an earl. The county was astonished. A penniless parson's daughter, tall and odd and 24, raised to a coronet by a man who could have had the season's reigning beauty. There were two ways to read such a match, and the kinder way was that the earl had taken pity, and the unkinder way was the one his cousin chose to whisper into every receptive ear, that the new countess had worked some art upon a grieving man, that she was clever in the way clever women were dangerous, and that it would all end badly for the house of Thornbeck. The cousin's name was Marcus Caulfield, and until Marizette walked up the aisle, he had been the earl's heir. The cruelty in this story was not the earl's. He was cold, and grief had made him careful with his own heart, in a way that read to strangers as hardness, but he was not cruel, and he was not the architect of the room at the cold end of the house. The architect was the smiling cousin who had counted on a childless, half-broken earl dying without an heir of his body, and who watched a tall, plain, clever girl with no fortune become Countess of Thornbeck, and understood before the wedding breakfast was cleared exactly what she... If she gave the earl a son, Caulfield would inherit nothing. So he set himself, with great patience and a pleasant face, to the work of removing her. The early married months were not unhappy, though they were strange. Lucan did not know how to be loved, and Marizette did not know how to ask to be. So they circled one another in the great house like two careful animals, and learned each other slowly through small offices. She found that he rose before dawn and walked the park alone in all weather. She found that he could not bear music, any music, and that the pianoforte in the long drawing-room had stood closed since his first wife died. She found that he was unfailingly courteous to his servants, and unfailingly distant from his own pleasure, as though he had decided somewhere in the years of his mourning that he had forfeited the right to be happy and meant to keep to the bargain. And she found the passage. The steward's grandson, a solemn boy of 9 named Jem Wenlock, took her hand one wet afternoon and led her to the dressing closet of the east wing, then unhasped a panel she would never have found in a lifetime of searching, and showed her the narrow, dark throat of stone that ran down inside the wall. He told her the masons had built it when the house was new, so the family might go to the chapel in plague years without crossing the servants' floors, and that his grandfather knew of it, and the master did not, because the master had been a second son raised away from the house and had never been told the half of its secrets. Marizette went down at once holding the boy's candle and came out behind a linen press in the muniment room, blinking, delighted, and swore her solemn oath of silence, and thought no more of it for months. She would have cause to think of it again. First, though, she had to understand that she was being hunted, and that understanding came slowly, because it was meant to. It began with small wrongnesses. A letter she had written and sealed for the post arrived at its recipient, unsealed and altered, so that an ordinary line of family news, read as the rambling of a disordered mind, she had not written those words. She knew she had not. Lucan looked at the letter, returned by an offended cousin of his own, and looked at her, and said nothing. And the saying nothing was the first cold thing he had ever done to her. Then a maid swore she had seen the Countess weeping in the gallery at 2 a.m, and speaking to the portraits. Marizette had been asleep. She knew she had been asleep. She had no proof of sleep, though, and a wife cannot summon witnesses to her own unconsciousness, and the maid was certain, and the maid was lying, and Marisette could not yet say why a maid should lie. The dismissive word was first spoken aloud, where she was meant to hear it, and could not answer it. She had come down early to the breakfast room and stood in the cold hall outside, and through the half-open door she heard the cousin's pleasant, carrying voice say to her husband gently, as a man reluctant to wound, that the poor countess was clearly not herself, that there was a softness in the brain that ran in some families and showed itself after a marriage, and that Lucan must steel himself to do what was kind, rather than what was easy. Marisette stood in the cold hall with her hand on the door, and heard her husband say nothing, and the nothing was louder than the cousin's voice, and she went back up the stairs without her breakfast, and was sick into the basin in her room. If you have or been told patiently, and by someone with a kind face, that you are losing your mind, you will know that the cruelty of it is not the accusation. The cruelty is that it teaches you to doubt the one instrument you have to defend yourself, which is your own certainty. Marisette began to check the clocks against each other. She began to write down the hour she went to sleep and the hour she woke, in a small hand, in a book she hid inside the lining of her work-basket. She began, in short, cadaver evidence, because she was a clergyman's daughter who had grown up arguing scripture across a kitchen table, and she did not know how to meet a lie except with a fact. And the gathering of facts was the thing that saved her, in the end, though it nearly killed her first. She learned 3 things over 6 careful weeks. Every staged scene of her supposed madness occurred on a night when the cousin was a guest in the house, and on no other night. The physician who had been sent for, a smooth man named Dr. Ray, had dined alone with the cousin twice before he ever examined her, and had asked his questions in a manner less like a doctor seeking truth than a clerk confirming an answer already written. And from a single overheard half-sentence on the back stairs she learned that there was a paper kept among the muniment records that mattered very much to her enemy, a paper he visited and handled and locked away again, a paper to do with the entail and the succession of the estate. She did not yet know what the paper was. She knew only that the man hunting her kept it close, and that the room it lived in was the very room a forgotten passage opened into. And she understood then, with a cold, clean shock, that the secret a child had made her swear to keep might be her door to freedom. She told no one. There was no one to tell. Mrs. Brierly loved her but could be dismissed. Her husband had begun to look at her across the dinner table as though she were a window through which he saw something painful, and she could not tell whether the pain in his face was for her or for himself, and she was too proud and too frightened to ask. The night they shut her up it had gone like this. A great dinner, the county invited, the long table blazing. The cousin, charming, attentive, refilling her glass himself and pressing her to take wine she did not want. A faintness she could not account for, the room tilting. Her own voice, far away, saying something she could not afterward remember. Something about a man among the muniment shelves, the very words the maid had sworn to weeks before, as though the accusation had been written and she had been made to read her lines. And then her husband's face above her, white and terrible, and his arms lifting her, and his voice saying her name once, broken, before the careful cousin laid a hand on his sleeve and murmured that it was time, that it was past time, that he must be brave for her sake. They carried her up to the east wing. The key turned twice, and the cousin stood in the gallery below and looked up at the locked door, with the patient face of a man whose long sum has finally come right. She slept the drugged sleep off and woke clear and lay in the cold and understood that she had 2 choices. She could be the madwoman they had built, beat upon the door, scream her innocence, and prove their case with every cry. Or she could be quiet and clever and patient as her enemy was patient, and find the paper that was the spine of the whole lie. She chose the second because the first was what they expected, and she had learned that the only freedom left to her was to do the thing that was not expected. She did not escape that first night. The not escaping is the truest part of the story. The passage was there, certainly. The cousin, careful in all things, had set a man to watch the muniment room by night, for he was not a fool, and he knew the paper was his weakness as well as his strength. So Marizette went down the cold, narrow passage the second night, her heart loud, and came to the low door behind the press, and put her eye to its crack and saw a footman dozing in a chair, with a branch of candles burning beside the very press that held the paper. She went back up. She did not weep. She lay in the dark and thought. What she did instead took 11 days, and it was made of small things, because small things were all a locked woman had. She had learned in her weeks of watching that the cousin's watchman was a young footman named Piatt, who was afraid of the dark and fonder of the bottle than his place could allow. She had learned that Mrs. Rarely, forbidden the wing, still left a covered plate at the foot of the back stair each evening out of love, and that the maid who carried it up could be spoken to through the door for the length of one verse of a hymn before she grew frightened. So Marizette began slowly to send words out of her tomb. Not please, facts, a line at a time, the hour the master walked the park, the day Dr. Ray was expected again, a question, passed down through Mrs. Gam, walks. Rarely to old Wenlock the steward, the only man besides a 9-year-old boy who knew the house, had a hidden vein of stone in its walls. The steward was the hinge of it, for the story turns on a tired old man's loyalty. Wenlock had served the Earl's father and grandfather, and he had watched the cousin grow from a charming boy into a charming man, with a counting-house where his heart should be, and he had never said so to a living soul, because a steward who accuses the heir is a steward turned off without a character. Yet Wenlock had loved the first countess, who had been kind to him and had watched his master die a little more each year inside the iron of his mourning, and then watched a tall, plain, clever girl come into the house and open a window in a man he had thought sealed shut for good. Now that girl was locked at the cold end of the house being called mad, and the steward who had kept the secret of the passage all his long life made up his mind to keep it no longer. He could not free her. A steward has no keys to a wife. He could tell her one thing she had not known, though passed up the back stair in a folded scrap inside the covered plate, and the one thing was grave. The paper the cousin guarded was a deed of entail that had been altered. The true entail, signed by the Earl's grandfather, settled the estate upon the Earl and the heirs of his body, and only if there were none upon the cousin's line. The cousin had paid a clerk to forge a second instrument, a supposed later deed that cut out any heir of the present Earl's body, and settled the whole upon the cousin direct, and he had meant all along to produce it the day the Earl died, and the day no son existed to contest it. A barren, or banished or dead wife, served his purpose perfectly. A wife who gave the Earl a son undid him entirely. Wenlock had seen the forged deed once, years before, when the cousin had carelessly left the muniment room while the steward was working there, and he had said nothing because what was a steward's word against an heir's, and because he had not then understood what it meant. Now he understood, and so did Marizette, lying in the cold with a folded scrap pressed to her mouth. The forged deed was the paper in the press. To prove herself sane, she did not need to prove herself sane at all, which was impossible, since sanity has no witnesses. She needed to prove the cousin a forger, and the proof was a forged document, guarded in a room she alone in all the house could enter unseen, by a passage the cousin did not know existed. The grave they had built around her had a door in its floor, and the cousin was standing on it. The difficulty remained. The watchman. Piatt sat with the candles each night, and the candles meant Marizette could not so much as ease the low door open without being seen. She turned the problem over for 3 nights and solved it the way she solved everything, with patience and effect. She knew Piatt was afraid of the dark. She knew from Mrs. Braley that the cousin paid him only on the nights the cousin slept in the house, and that the cousin had ridden to the county town on the Thursday for the quarter sessions and would be 3 days gone. A man paid to watch on certain nights grows careless on the nights he has not watched himself. On the second night of the cousin's absence, Marizette went down the passage at the dead hour and put her eye to the crack and found Piatt not dozing, but gone. The chair empty, the candles guttered to stubs, the room dark, and the press unguarded. He had slipped away to the warm kitchen and the bottle the moment the cousin's horse was through the gates, exactly as a frightened idle man would. She eased the low door open. It made the small particular sound of old wood, and she froze with her heart in her throat, and waited, but no one came. She stepped out behind the linen press into the muniment room, into the smell of dust and old leather and cold ink, and stood in the dark and made herself be still until her eyes found the gray shapes of the shelves. The press that held the paper was locked. She had known it would be. A clergyman's daughter who has spent 11 days planning a single hour does not come to a locked press without a thought for the lock. And Marisette had spent one of her smuggled messages asking Mrs. Brearley a careful question about who kept the muniment keys, and the answer was that the cousin kept one, and the steward kept the duplicate, as stewards always do, and that Wenlock, on the night he learned the cousin would be at the sessions, had left his duplicate inside the covered plate beneath a folded napkin. An old man risking his place and his name. On the chance that a locked woman could reach a locked press, she had the key. She turned it. The press opened, and inside, among the estate's dull ledgers, lay a flat tin box, and inside the box lay 2 documents, folded in legal ribbon. And she carried them to the window, where the moon came thin and gray through the old glass, and read them by that cold light, her hands shaking now that the worst was nearly over, and saw at once that Wenlock had told the truth. One deed was old, the parchment gone amber, the grandfather's signature firm and faded, settling Thornbeck upon the Earl and the heirs of his body. The other was newer, the ink too black, the hand of the supposed grandfather subtly wrong, and it cut out the heirs of the Earl's body and gave all to the cousin's line, and it was dated 4 years after the grandfather was in his grave. A man cannot sign a deed 4 years dead. The forger had made one small, arrogant error, a date, because he had needed the false deed to seem the later instrument, and had not troubled to check when the old man died. It was enough. It was everything. Marisette did not take the forged deed and flee. She was cleverer than that, and she understood her enemy. If she carried the paper up the passage and produced it herself, a locked madwoman with a stolen document, the cousin would swear she had forged it in her cell to slander an honest man, and Dr. Ray would nod, and the county would believe the smiling cousin over the strange wife, and she would be back in the cold wing by Christmas with the door nailed shut. The paper had to be found, not produced. It had to be exposed in the open before witnesses, in the hand of the man who had hidden it, by someone the county could not dismiss. And there was only one such person in the world, her husband. So she did the hardest thing in the whole story. Harder than the cold, and the passage, and the dark. She put the forged deed back. She locked the press. She left the proof of her innocence exactly where her enemy had hidden it, and she climbed back up the dark wall to her grave, and she sent out one more message. The most dangerous of all, because it had to reach the one man she could not be certain still loved her. There was a thing happening to the Earl all the while his wife planned in the dark. He was not at peace. Locking her away had not closed the matter for him, as the cousin had promised it would. He walked the park before dawn and could not feel his own feet. He sat at the long table where they had dined together and could not eat. He had carried her up the stairs himself, and the weight of her in his arms had been the realest thing he had touched in 3 years, and he had set her down behind a locked door because a man with a kind face had told him, over and over, gently, that it was love to do so. And in the cold mornings, Lucan began, slowly, to doubt. He remembered that his wife had never once, in 11 months, said a single foolish thing. He remembered that her supposed fits came always when the house was full, and never when it was empty. He remembered, with a lurch, that the night she collapsed, it had been his cousin who pressed the wine on her, his cousin's hand, on his sleeve, saying it was time, his cousin's voice naming the very madness the maid had sworn to, weeks before, as though the script had been written and the players cued. He did not yet have a fact. He had only the cold beginning of one, and then his wife sent him a fact, and the cold beginning became a fire. The message reached him, folded inside a book. A volume of sermons Mrs. Menda Brearley left on the hall table, where the master always took up his morning reading, and it was 3 lines in his wife's small, clear hand, and it did not plead, and it did not weep. It said that there were 2 deeds in the tin box in the locked press of the muniment room. It said that one was dated 4 years after his grandfather's death. It said that he should send for his attorney and Dr. Ray and Lady Petheridge, and any other honest witness he trusted, and open the box himself before them all on a day his cousin was in the house, and ask his cousin to explain the date. That was all. No accusation. No defense of her own mind. Only a door held open, and the choice to walk through it left entirely to him. Lucan read the 3 lines 4 times standing in the cold hall, and something in his face that had been locked since the first Countess died came open, and he went up to the east wing himself and stood outside the door he had turned the key in and put his hand flat against the oak. He did not unlock it. He understood, as his wife had understood, that to free her now was to ruin her, that a freed madwoman and her loyal husband would convince no one, and that the only road to her freedom ran through the open exposure of the man who had built her grave. So he stood with his hand on the door and his forehead against it, and through the wood his wife heard him, and put her own hand against the same oak from the other side, and neither of them spoke, because there were watchers, and because some things do not need to be spoken to be known. He set the scene for the following Tuesday, when the cousin would be at the house for the rent audit. He sent quietly for his attorney from the county town, a dry, careful man named Loftus, on the pretext of estate business. He invited Lady Petheridge, the sharpest and most respected widow in the county, a woman whose verdict on any matter was the county's verdict within a week, on the pretext of dinner. He let Dr. Ray be summoned by the cousin himself, as the cousin meant to summon him to pronounce once more upon the countess and arrange her removal to a private house in the north, for the cousin grew impatient now and wished the wife not merely locked but gone. And the cousin, smiling, suspecting nothing, walked into the trap of his own confidence, because the one thing his careful sums had never reckoned was that the cold earl might wake. On the Tuesday, they gathered in the long drawing-room after the audit, the attorney with his papers, Lady Petheridge with her lorgnette, Dr. Ray smooth and ready with his diagnosis, and the cousin at his ease before the fire. The pianoforte stood closed in the corner, as it had stood for 3 years. Lucan came in last, and he had given orders that surprised his household, for he had sent 2 grooms up to the east wing and had his wife brought down, not as a prisoner dragged, but on his own arm, dressed in her own gray gown, pale and thin and perfectly composed. And he walked her into the room full of witnesses, and seated her in a chair by the fire as though she were what she was, the Countess of Thornbeck, mistress of the house. The cousin's smile did not waver, but his eyes went to the earl's face and found something there he had not seen before. A small, careful man who has built his whole life on reading faces felt for the first time the floor move under him. He recovered at once. He rose and said gently that this was unwise, that the poor countess should not be exposed, so that her affliction made company a danger to her, and he looked to Dr. Ray, who cleared his throat and began upon the softness of the brain that ran in some families. Lady Petheridge watched the countess over her lorgnette and said nothing, because Lady Petheridge had buried 2 husbands in a great many illusions, and knew the difference between a mad woman and a quiet one when she saw it sit by a fire with its hands folded and its eyes clear. Lucan let the doctor finish. Then he crossed the room, not to his wife, but to the attorney, and asked him in a level voice that carried, to be so good as to produce the deeds of entail from the muniment room, as a matter of estate business arising from the day's audit, and to lay the tin box on the table that all present, as gentlemen, might confirm the succession of Thornbeck was in order. The cousin's face changed, then only a little. A man watching closely, and the whole room was watching closely, now saw the smile hold, while the eyes went still, the way a pond goes still the instant before the ice. Beneath it cracks. He said smoothly that surely this was no fit moment for dry estate matters, that the box was his own to keep as the heir, that the key was mislaid. And Lucan said, his voice low and even, that the steward kept a duplicate, and that he had it here. And he laid old Wenlock's key upon the table, and the small sound of it ringing on the wood was the loudest sound in the house. They opened the box before them all. The attorney unfolded the two deeds and laid them side by side, and read out, in his dry, careful voice, the date upon the second. And Lady Petheridge leaned forward with her lorgnette and read it again herself, and looked up and said, in the flat, clear tone of a woman delivering a county's verdict, that a man 4 years in his grave had signed this deed, and that she should like very much to hear how. The room turned, every face, to Marcus Caulfield, and the careful man, the smiling man, the patient man who had built a grave around an innocent woman, one staged scene at a time, opened his mouth, and found for the first time in his life that he had no pleasant word ready. He said the date was an error of the clerk's. He said the deed was old, and the ink only seemed fresh. He said, his voice rising, now fragmenting, that the Countess was mad, and had tampered with the box herself, and Lady Petheridge said, dry as a closing door, that the box had been opened in their sight by the Earl's own hand with the steward's key, and that the Countess had not crossed the room. It was Dr. Ray who broke first, as the bought always break before the principal, for the bought have less to lose by truth, and more to lose by sharing the fall. See, has. He set down his glass and said, in the voice of a man stepping back from a fire he had helped to light, that he had examined the Countess and found her of perfectly sound mind, and that he had been told otherwise, and pressed otherwise, and had let himself be guided where an honest physician should not be guided, and that he would say so before any magistrate in the county. And Marizette, who had said not one word through all of it, who had sat by the fire with her hands folded and let the facts she had gathered in the dark do the speaking, lifted her clear eyes to her husband across the room. She did not gloat, she did not rise to accuse. She had demonstrated her worth in 11 days of silent gathering. And let the demonstration stand. Lucan crossed the room to her at last. The whole county would tell the story afterward, and they would all agree on this one moment, the cold Earl crossing his own drawing-room to the wife he had locked away, and stopping before her chair, and going down on one knee on the hearthstone, so that his grave face was level with hers. He took her hand, the worn glove, and the thin wrist, and he said, into the held silence of the watching-room, 6 words, and they were not a poem, and they were not a speech. He said, Marizette, you were never anything but sound. He had used her given name. He had named her sane before them all, in the very room where the verdict had been rendered against her, and he had asked for nothing in return and offered everything. And that was the calibrated whole of it, a name and a kneeling and a plain, true sentence, and it was enough to remake her world. The cousin was not destroyed. That is not how this house keeps its accounts. He was exposed, and the attorney drew up the matter that very week for the magistrate, and the forged deed was burned in the proper way before witnesses, and the true entail restored, dotching. And the cousin was required to quit the county, and live abroad upon a small fixed sum. The Earl settled on him in mercy he did not deserve, and perhaps because the Earl could not bear to add a hanging to the house's grief. He went. He took his pleasant face to a foreign town where no one yet knew to mistrust it. And before he went on the last day, he stood in the gallery where he had once looked up at a locked door with the satisfaction of a man whose long sum had come right. And he looked at the Countess passing below on her husband's arm, free and pale and unhurried, and something in his face for one instant was not smiling, and was something very near to understanding. He had read every face in the county, and built his whole life upon it, and he had never once read hers, because he had decided what she was, before he troubled to look. Dr. Ray kept his word, and confessed before the magistrate, and was disgraced but not ruined, for he had broken before he was made to, and the county, which is slow but in the end sound, judged him a weak man rather than a wicked one. Old Wenlock the steward was called before the Earl and stood twisting his hat, certain he was to be turned off for keeping the secret of the passage all his life, and for risking his place on the chance that a locked woman could reach a locked press. Lucan looked at him a long moment, and then took the old man's hand, as he had taken his wife's, and thanked him plainly for being the only honest servant in a house that had failed its mistress, and raised his wage, and bid him keep the secret of the passage still, for every house should have one door that opens only for love. The boy Jem Wenlock, who had started the whole long chain by leading a new bride to a panel in a dressing closet, was found by Marisette in the kitchen garden a week after, and she knelt to his height and told him he had given her the most useful secret in all of England, and that she would keep his oath forever. And the solemn child went scarlet and said he had known all along she was clever. She laughed the first time in many weeks, and the sound of it carried into the house through an open window where her husband stood, and he closed his eyes the way a man closes his eyes in sun after a long cold. There was an old grief in Lucan still, and it explained a great deal. His first wife, the kind Countess old Wenlock had grieved, had died of a fever after a long labor, and the child with her, and Lucan had been away at the time, summoned to London on the very county business his cousin had arranged to take him away, though that he would not understand for years yet. He had come home to a still house, and a closed pianoforte, for she had been playing The Night the Pains Began, a country dance, and the music had stopped in the middle of a phrase and never finished. That was why he could not bear music. That was why he had decided he had forfeited the right to be happy, and had kept to the bargain for 3 hard years. And when Marisette learned this, not from him at first, but from Mrs. Burleigh, she did not press him, and she did not pity him aloud. She waited. Undone. On a quiet evening near Christmas, when the house was settling and the snow had begun, she went to the long drawing room where the pianoforte had stood closed for 3 years and 3 months, and she opened it, very gently, and she did not sit to play. She only opened it, and left it open, and went away. And in the night Lucan came down alone, as she had known he would, and stood before the open instrument a long time in the dark. And at last he put one finger to a key, and let the single note fall into the still house, and then another, slow and uncertain, a man finishing at last a phrase that had hung unfinished for 3 years. Marisette stood at the top of the stair in her nightgown and heard it, and did not go down. Some doors a person must walk through alone. In the morning the pianoforte was open still, and it was never closed again. They did not become all at once a happy and easy couple, for neither of them was made easy, and the marriage they built was a quiet one, made of small offices as it had always been, though the smallness now was warmth and not distance. He learned to come to her in the evenings and tell her the dull business of the estate, because she listened as no one had ever listened to him. She learned to ask him plainly for the things she wanted, as she had asked him plainly that first night at the assembly, because plainness was the only language they had ever both spoken. He gave her the muniment room key on a ribbon, and told her dryly that she had proved its better keeper. She had a chair set in the east wing sitting room, the cold room, where she had counted his footsteps, with a fire kept burning in it always, and she went and sat there sometimes, not from grief, but from a kind of pride, for it was the room in which she had refused to be made mad, and a woman should honor the place of her own courage. And there was a son the following autumn, a dark, grave-eyed boy, who would inherit Thornbeck and all its hidden veins of stone, and the entail that settled him there was the true one, signed by a man in his grave who had wanted nothing more than that the house pass to the heirs of his blood. The day the boy was christened, the cousin was a small fixed figure in a foreign town who would never see the house again. And Dr. Ray was a chastened man, mending his practice, and old Wenlock stood at the back of the chapel in his best coat, and wept without shame, and Lady Petheridge, godmother by her own firm decree, held the child and pronounced him sound, and the word which had once been a sentence against the mother was now a blessing upon the son. If this story has stayed with you, sit a moment longer with its last picture before you go. On a clear night the following spring, Marisette stood at the tall window of the east wing sitting room, the room with the fire now always lit, and looked out over the dark park where the bare elms had come into leaf at last. Her husband came and stood beside her, and neither of them spoke, because they had learned that the truest things between them were the unspoken ones. Below the window, Somewhere in the thickness of the old wall ran the narrow throat of stone that a child had shown a bride. The passage the careful man had forgotten or never learned, the only door in all the cold house that had been entirely hers. She had not needed it again. She hoped she never would. Still, she liked to know it was there, the way one likes to know there is a candle in the drawer though the lamps are lit, a small dark certainty kept against the dark. She put her hand against the cold glass, as she had on the first locked afternoon, and this time the warmth of the room was at her back, and her husband's hand came to rest over hers, and the house held them both, and the night outside was only a night, and held nothing she feared.